we will be examining the 50-day period of time between Passover and Pentecost. Those two words hopefully sound familiar to you because they're in the biblical text. They are talking about a period of time when people had to flee imminent danger in the middle of the night into a wilderness of unknown factors. How did they endure it? What skills did they utilize to overcome the trials and tribulations which they faced? What was God trying to reveal to them? And why, throughout the biblical text, are we told that these types of skills and training should be repeated on an annual basis, even today? The Hebrew word for festival is the word moed, which means rehearsal or practice. These rehearsals were periods of time and training that were to be done forever and annually. So if you were to practice these skills annually within their given time frame, you'll discover all sorts of rich content, training that is seasonal, and also better preparing you to be a good steward of your environment and master of the woods you find yourself in at the time. So instead of focusing on the skills of the 17th century long hunter or the ancient cave dweller, we're simply performing experimental archaeology as it relates to the biblical text. So in Genesis chapter 3, you see that the first thing that God did before he kicked Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden was teach them to make clothing from animal skins. Now the word make is very impressive because it is the Hebrew word asal. That word means to fully transmit an idea or teaching so that it can be fully understood and utilized later. Now generally, when we see the word make, it's something we kind of gloss over in the Bible. But think about this for a moment. If he fully transmitted the idea of making clothing from animal skins, it included animal harvest and identification, how to utilize all the parts of the animal for food, meat, etc., clothing, obviously, how to sew those things, how to make bone needles, how to utilize every part of the animal to accomplish their goal, which is ultimately self-reliance. God was preparing them to be apart from his presence, and because of that, they were going to need to know survival skills just so that they could make it. That's what leads us into our first annual training cycle. Thousands of years later, we become familiar with Moses and the biblical Passover. Now, upon looking at our survival triangle, we have what we call PPS, okay? And that is the 3 annual cycles of training that are within the Bible. These are 3 annual holidays that every male was required to celebrate and come to Jerusalem to observe. This is in the Old Testament, and it also carries through into the New Testament. So, our first one is Passover, and these are the things that make up our survival triangle. Because without these, we cannot be a completed spiritual person. And by completing these 3 holiday cycles, we'll become a more spiritually fulfilled person, a better steward of our environment and our natural resources. So during the biblical Passover, in the middle of the night, Moses was called up by Pharaoh after an onslaught of various plagues that hit the people of Egypt. They had to do a bug out in the middle of the night. So in the midnight hour, 100,000 fighting men and all the women, children, grandparents, livestock, everything they owned had to be carried out. So they took off. They go about 26 or so miles on their first night as a tribe out of Egypt before they took their first camp. That is an emergency survival situation. A sudden onslaught of terror has just happened. In the middle of the night, they are forced out of their homes and they flee with everything they can carry on their backs and on their carts. Whatever or conveyance they had was taken with them. Now, that went on for an entire week. It took them a week before they got to the Red Sea. So for the first 7 days, they were largely relying on the gear and on the foodstuffs that they brought with them, which is very important to consider because once they passed through the Red Sea area, They were now largely devoid of all the bread that they had brought with them, all the meat stuffs they had brought with them, and now they're beginning to complain and to grumble because the immediate life-threatening situation has now passed. They're now safe on the other side. Pharaoh and his armies has been wiped out by the Red Sea, and now they have to learn to depend upon God for their provision. So that's when we see the manna begin to fall from the sky. That's when we later see quail populating the desert. And that's when we begin to see another impartation of God's grace given through Moses so that they could learn to become self-reliant. It's a very big misnomer that we just expect that people back then knew how to live off the land. And that is not at all the case. They were suburbanites like the rest of us. They went to the market. Some of them raised their own food, but most did not. They had to buy it at the market. Some knew pottery skills, some knew how to work gold, and were various types of craftsmen. But largely, the skills were spread out among all the people, so it took a large community to make things happen. So, for the next several weeks, they learned to rely upon God in the desert, learning to make water filters, how to snare and trap quail for their food. All these things went on for the first 50 days after the Passover. That is where we get into Pentecost. So our Passover season is one that leads us through a period of bug out, if you will, or emergency survival training. Once they reached the mountain in the desert called Mount Sinai, where God gave them the Ten Commandments, when God came down on that mountain, that was the day of Pentecost. During Pentecost, we know that Moses went up to receive the Ten Commandments. God spoke to the entire nation of people, and they received and agreed to accept his covenant with them. Now, what's interesting is that by that point, they were already dependent upon God. So they were depending upon him for water, for food, for all their basic needs. In the midst of that, they were also securing things from the natural environment that they might be able to use for their survival. We know one of the first things they did is make a golden calf, thinking that it was the right thing to do. That's why Moses, after 40 days up on the mountain, came down, threw the commandments down in disgust. And then it was at that point that God said, hey, Moses, I'll make you great. Let's just kill the rest of these yahoos because they just broke the agreement that they just agreed to receive. So Moses went back up the mountain and spent another 40 days and 40 nights. This is important to consider because their disobedience resulted in an additional 40-day period to where they must again learn to rely on God. So they were there about 80 days total right there. This is pretty cool because in that process, God is teaching them a lesson, if you will, and they are depleting every ounce of resource that they have. And they are in the middle of the Arabian desert. There wasn't much there but rocks and dirt. So, after this period of time, they come into agreement with Moses. Moses begged God for grace. God granted it. And then they moved on into their time of approaching the land of Israel, or the promised land at that time. Now, the season of Pentecost is one of wilderness, wandering, and dwelling. So, they're learning to utilize their resources to the best of their ability because they're not yet very skilled. So I call this our bushcraft and woodcraft season. We learn to identify the trees, the plants, the animals, and how to utilize them for resources for our survival and long-term self-reliance. Now, this takes us into the final season, which is called Sukkot. During the holiday of Sukkot, you are to go and build a debris shelter and live in it for a week. This is the holiday mentioned in the New Testament, specifically in the book of Revelation, that it says that we will do even after Jesus comes back. So this holiday is of great importance. Not only is it the actual birth date of the Messiah on the earth, but it's also a holiday of rest, rejuvenation in the spirit, and of obedience and fulfillment of God's provision throughout the land. At the season of Passover, we have the spring feast, we have spring storms, We have the spring harvest. We're in garden planting season, and all these great things are happening in the spring. We're all excited. But it's also a period of potential danger due to weather anomalies, a potential bug out, such as it was in Pharaoh's time and Moses' time, and that'll lead us into the wilderness. Once we're in the wilderness, we're harvesting our gardens. We're learning to utilize the resources. All the medicinal and edible plants are in full swing throughout the summer months. And then as we get into fall, we have the final fall harvest. During the final fall harvest, we're going to be seeing nuts, persimmons, and a variety of other types of plants and medicinals that we're able to take advantage of. And these are the things that we're to decorate the Sukkot with. The Sukkot meaning temporary shelter or camp. That's what the holiday is all about. We spend a week now understanding all of the resources that we've collected over the year, and we can now rest in our self-reliance. The difference between survival and self-reliance is simply a matter of confidence. Survival means having difficulty accomplishing a specific task. Doesn't matter what the task is. You could be surviving just to drive your car through the day. You could be surviving to get a meal. Whatever the case is, it's something that gives you great difficulty. Self-reliance, on the other hand, is having confidence in your ability to provide for yourself. So struggle and confidence. The key is just having confidence in your abilities, and that is ultimately what God is after. Confidence in our relationship with Him, confidence that He does have a plan, and that all the outdoor skills we do can put us in a unique position to realize that, hey, the Bible makes sense in all these outdoor skills we do together. It all congeals into an actual annual training cycle and pattern that we all practice, we just don't realize we do it. So that is what the survival triangle represents. And we have a passage of scripture here in Proverbs 22:3. It says, "The prepared man foresees danger and takes precaution, while the simpleton goes blindly along and suffers the consequences." So that's Proverbs 22:3. We foresee the danger. We all feel it. That's probably why you're watching this video series. You want to be better prepared for something that you feel may occur. Well, the Bible's already told us, whether or not you believe it, it gives us an annual pattern and a cycle with which we could all identify with and bring it all together where it makes more sense. And all it's designed to do is make us better stewards of our environment and a more spiritually connected people.